When pride meets the power of nature, disaster follows fast. From hikers chasing selfies to campers ignoring safety rules, every mistake in bear country comes with brutal consequences. Grizzlies, black bears, and polar bears all struck without warning, turning carelessness into chaos and arguments into tragedy. Each roar, swipe, and scream proved one truth: nature doesn't forgive arrogance. These stories show how a single reckless choice can turn calm wilderness into a deadly encounter. In this video, we'll dive into 6 chilling tales of bear attacks, exploring how human errors led to these terrifying events. It was September 14th, 2025, in the remote woodlands of eastern Russia, where endless forests stretched toward the horizon. The late summer air was warm but heavy with moisture, and the scent of pine and damp soil lingered among the tall firs. Sunlight filtered through drifting mist, giving the woods an eerie calm. That morning, a small group of hikers gathered near a protected nature reserve to explore the rugged terrain, known for its striking scenery and elusive wildlife. Among them were 2 close friends from the nearby city, Elena Voronova, 34, and Irina Kozlova, 37. They worked together at a travel agency that specialized in adventure tours across the Far East. Elena was outgoing and fearless, drawn to challenges that tested her limits. Her social media pages were filled with pictures of remote mountains and wild coasts, each one marked by her confident smile. Irina, more reserved, admired her friend's daring nature, but preferred quiet moments in nature over risk. They balanced each other, Elena's thrill-seeking energy and Irina's steady calm, a friendship shaped by contrast and trust. Their guide, Oleg Mikhailov, had spent years leading groups through the region's wilderness. He was known for his caution and deep respect for wildlife. Before they began, he reminded everyone to stay close and never wander off the marked path. Recent reports had warned of increased bear movement as the animals prepared for hibernation, and he wanted no mistakes. The group started their trek beneath a pale, golden sun. The path wound between mossy trees and slow streams. Birds called from above, and the rhythm of footsteps echoed softly through the undergrowth. Hours passed peacefully, until they reached a wide hilltop overlooking the forest. From there, the landscape spread out in a patchwork of grass and scattered trees, glowing faintly in the afternoon light. Elena stopped, struck by how perfect the clearing looked for photos. The open grass caught the sunlight just right, and the trees framed the view like a painting. Ignoring her guide's warnings that echoed in her memory, she stepped beyond the marked trail, eager for a better angle. Her boots sank into the soft ground as she raised her camera, focusing on the distant line of hills. Irina hesitated at the edge of the path, torn between worry and trust. She called out softly, but her friend's excitement overpowered her caution. Reluctantly, she followed, watching the grass bend under their steps as they moved deeper into the clearing. Neither noticed the quiet shift of the forest, the stillness that often comes before something terrible. Under a dense cluster of trees not far away, a massive grizzly bear rested among the shadows. The faint sounds of laughter and snapping twigs reached its ears. Startled and disoriented, it rose to its full height, the sunlight glinting off its thick brown fur. Its muscles tensed, nostrils flaring as it searched for the source of the disturbance. The bear charged. It burst through the undergrowth with explosive force, the sound of breaking branches ripping through the quiet air. Elena turned too late. The animal struck her down in an instant, her camera falling to the ground as its claws tore through the brush. Irina rushed forward, but the bear's strength sent her sprawling backward into the grass. Shouts erupted behind them as Oleg and the other hikers raced toward the chaos, waving sticks and raising their voices to create noise. The forest filled with panic. Dust, leaves, and fear spun together in a blur of motion. Oleg fired a flare into the air, its bright light slicing through the canopy. The crack echoed, startling the bear long enough for it to stop. With a deep growl, it turned, retreating toward the dark edge of the trees. Silence fell again, broken only by ragged breathing and the fading hum of the flare as it drifted away. Oleg ran to the fallen women. Elena lay motionless, her body marked by deep wounds, the ground around her stained dark. Irina was barely conscious, her breathing shallow and uneven. The others gathered in shock, their faces pale as Oleg tore strips of fabric from his pack to press against her bleeding shoulder and side. The radio crackled weakly as he called for help, his voice low and steady, though fear edged every word. They stayed close together, scanning the trees in case the bear returned. The air was heavy and still, the world holding its breath as they waited. When the rescue team finally arrived nearly 2 hours later, the scene was grim. The medics worked swiftly, their hands moving with quiet precision. Irina was lifted onto a stretcher and given oxygen, her body covered in blood-soaked bandages. Nearby, another blanket was gently placed over Elena. The remaining hikers stood in stunned silence, the reality of what had happened sinking in like cold rain. By late afternoon, the team began their slow descent toward the ranger post. The forest was quiet again, its beauty turned hollow by the memory of what it had taken. When they reached the edge of the reserve, an ambulance waited on the dirt road. Irina was rushed to a hospital in the city, her condition critical but stable. The others were treated for shock and minor injuries. Officials later confirmed that the bear had been startled awake by sudden movement and acted defensively. It was not pursued, as the attack was ruled a natural reaction to disturbance. The site was closed, and new signs were placed along the trails, warning visitors never to step beyond the marked boundaries. News of the incident spread quickly across the region. Wildlife experts repeated the same message, that wild animals, no matter how familiar the environment seems, remain unpredictable. Even experienced hikers must respect the rules meant to protect both people and wildlife. Days later, Elena's memorial was held in her hometown. Friends and family gathered quietly to remember her fearless spirit and love of exploration. Irina remained in the hospital, recovering slowly from her wounds, haunted by the loss of her closest friend. The forest returned to silence, but that silence carried a warning, one written in memory and grief. In those wild places where beauty meets danger, even a single careless step can change everything. It was July 28, 2024, deep in the forests of central Alaska, where tall spruce trees surrounded a quiet campground near a large wilderness reserve. The night air was crisp, scented with pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the chirps of crickets and the distant rush of a river winding through the valley. Among the weekend campers was Linda Whitman, 44, an office manager from Portland who had driven north for a solo trip. She had grown up hiking with her father and believed she understood the wild well enough to handle it alone. Years of camping across the country had given her confidence, perhaps too much. She often trusted instinct over instruction, convinced that experience was its own protection. That afternoon, Linda arrived early and set up her tent beside her silver SUV. Rangers had given a safety briefing, reminding everyone to store food inside their vehicles to keep wildlife away. She nodded politely but listened only half-heartedly. To her, the wilderness was a place for peace, not constant caution. Her cooler, filled with meat, sweets, and soft drinks, stayed outside beneath the open sky. The faint smell of sugar and cooked food drifted into the trees, carried by the still summer air. As darkness fell, the campground settled into quiet. A pale moon climbed above the treetops, and the breeze whispered through the branches. Inside her tent, Linda rested in her sleeping bag, the faint glow of her phone fading beside her. The forest seemed calm, endless, and safe. Then, sometime after 2 in the morning, the stillness broke. A rustle at the camp's edge, followed by the heavy sound of movement through the leaves. A black bear had wandered from the forest, drawn by the sugary scent. It moved slowly between parked cars, its nose twitching as it followed the invisible trail of food. When it reached Linda's sight, the animal found the cooler. With a single swipe, it tore the lid open, scattering wrappers and containers across the dirt. It lowered its head and began licking spilled juices and cream, grunting softly with each mouthful. Inside the tent, Linda stirred. The sound of dragging plastic and heavy breathing snapped her awake. At first, she thought it was wind, until a dark outline pressed against the thin fabric beside her. The ground trembled with each step. A massive paw sank into the earth inches from her head. Terror surged through her body. She bolted upright and stumbled from the tent. Cold air rushed over her skin as she sprinted toward her SUV, her feet tangling in the grass. Pain shot through her ankle as it twisted sharply, but adrenaline carried her forward. She climbed onto the hood, trembling, heart hammering so hard she could hear it echo in her ears. From that high perch, she saw the dark shape crouched over her campsite. The bear's head moved slowly, its muzzle buried in the remains of her cooler. Torn bags, crushed cans, and scraps of food littered the ground. The moonlight caught its fur in silver streaks as it fed, calm and unbothered by the human watching from above. Linda's hands shook as she fumbled for her phone. Her body trembled uncontrollably, breath ragged, every instinct telling her not to make a sound. The air was thick with the smell of sugar and smoke, the faint sweetness of spilled soda mingling with fear. Minutes crawled by in silence. The bear pawed through the debris, licking each container clean, its heavy breathing breaking the stillness. Linda dared not move. Her ankle throbbed, and cold sweat slicked her palms. The wilderness that had once felt so peaceful now seemed vast and unforgiving. Then faintly came the low hum of an engine. Headlights cut through the trees, a ranger truck approaching from the road. The beams swept across the clearing, striking the animal's face. The bear lifted its head, blinked against the glare, and hesitated. For a long moment it seemed to weigh its options. Then, with a deep snort, it turned and slipped into the forest, disappearing among the trees as silently as it had arrived. The rangers stepped out quickly, flashlights in hand. The ground was strewn with torn fabric, food scraps, and deep claw marks in the soil. The air smelled faintly of syrup and smoke. One ranger helped Linda down from the hood, steadying her as she winced from pain. Her ankle was swollen, but she was safe. The overwhelming fear in her face began to fade, replaced by exhausted relief. They treated her ankle and noted the cause of the incident: unsecured food storage. Around them, the forest slowly brightened as dawn crept over the horizon. The first light revealed the wreckage: a shredded tent, ripped cooler, and footprints pressed deep into the dirt. The faint sweetness of marshmallows and soda still hung in the air. As other campers emerged, quiet murmurs spread across the site. The rangers spoke firmly but calmly, explaining what had happened and why. Their message was clear: in the wilderness, even a small mistake can invite danger. Linda sat near her SUV, her ankle bandaged, watching as they cleaned the area. Her mind replayed the moment she had seen the bear's shadow against her tent, the closeness of it, the helplessness. The confidence that had carried her through years of camping felt hollow now, replaced by the sharp clarity that comes only after fear. By mid-morning, the campground looked calm again. The debris was cleared, the cool morning breeze washing over the trees. Before leaving, the rangers issued a citation for improper food storage and reminded her to always secure supplies. Linda packed slowly, careful with each movement. She glanced once more at the forest before climbing into her SUV. The trees swayed softly, sunlight spilling through the branches, the place serene again, as if the night's chaos had never happened. As she drove away, the golden light glimmered through the windshield. She felt the quiet weight of a lesson that would not fade. Confidence cannot replace caution in the wild. It was December 18th, 2023, along a frozen stretch of highway winding through the Yukon wilderness of northern Canada. The sun hung low behind a ceiling of gray clouds, casting pale light across endless snowfields and spruce trees glazed with ice. The air was sharp and still, and the road stretched ahead in perfect silence. Deborah Miller, 51, an office worker from Alberta, was driving her silver SUV north toward Whitehorse after visiting friends. She loved long, solitary road trips, the hum of the tires, the empty landscape, and the calm that came from being completely alone. The Yukon's vastness felt like freedom, though it demanded respect. Deborah had grown up in a small Canadian town, balancing city life with a lifelong love of the outdoors. Years of camping and hiking had built her confidence, and she often trusted her instincts over caution. That morning she stopped at a roadside diner in a small town before continuing north. After eating, she tossed her leftover wrappers and napkins into a plastic bag. Then later, without thinking, threw the bag out of the window as she drove. The faint smell of meat and grease lingered in the frigid air, carried far across the snow. The wrappers landed near the tree line, where the scent spread through the still wind. Deep in the forest, a grizzly bear lifted its head. Food was scarce in winter, and the smell of fat and salt cut through the cold. The animal began to move, slow but determined, following the invisible trail toward the highway. 20 minutes later, Deborah pulled into a small rest area overlooking a frozen river. She stepped out to stretch, her boots crunching on the icy gravel. The landscape was silent, no wind, no sound, but her breath. Then came a faint crack, the brittle snap of branches shifting under weight. From the trees emerged a grizzly, its thick fur dusted with frost. It moved with heavy grace, sniffing at the air. Deborah froze as she saw it. Massive, powerful, eyes black and fixed. The animal's nose led it straight toward her vehicle, where traces of food scent clung to the tires and doors. The bear reached the SUV and struck the bumper with one paw. The metallic clang echoed through the clearing. Panic surged through Deborah as she stumbled backward and threw herself inside the driver's seat. Her fingers fumbled with the keys, the tires spinning helplessly on ice. The grizzly reared up on its hind legs, towering above the windshield. Its paw came down with a violent crack, spreading a web of fractures across the glass. The entire frame shuddered. Deborah ducked instinctively, heart racing as claws scraped against metal. Each sound was deep, deliberate, and terrifyingly close. The bear circled the SUV, breathing heavily, fogging the windows with each exhale. Its snout brushed the door handle, leaving streaks of moisture that instantly froze. Deborah gripped the steering wheel, forcing herself not to move. The cold air burned in her lungs, her muscles locked in silence. For long minutes, the animal lingered. It pawed through the snow near the tires, drawn to the faint scent of grease. The SUV rocked slightly with each shove, the noise of metal bending beneath its strength. Deborah's foot hovered over the accelerator, but she dared not move. Her world had narrowed to the sound of her pulse and the soft rumble of the bear's breathing. Then the wind shifted. The scent of food drifted away into the forest. The bear lifted its head, nostrils flaring, and turned toward the trees. With a final snort, it lumbered off, its huge shape fading into the gray distance. For a moment, Deborah couldn't move. The silence that followed felt heavier than the noise had been. Her breath came in short, uneven gasps as she realized she had been holding it for far too long. When she finally turned the key again, the hum of the engine sounded fragile against the emptiness outside. She drove forward slowly, the cracked windshield catching the dim light. Her hands trembled on the wheel. Only when she reached the next stretch of open highway did she pull over, resting her forehead against the steering wheel. Her body shook from adrenaline, and tiny cuts from shattered glass stung her skin. The encounter had lasted only minutes, but it felt endless. Later that day, Deborah reached a ranger station near a small town. Officers inspected the vehicle, noting the claw marks and shattered glass. They confirmed her account. A grizzly, likely drawn by the scent of discarded food, had followed it from the forest. They reminded her that in the Yukon's frozen wilderness, even the faintest smell of grease or sugar could travel for miles and draw powerful predators to the roadside. The next morning, reports of the incident spread quickly through nearby communities. Rangers used the event as a warning, posting new signs at rest areas, urging travelers to secure all waste and keep vehicles scent-free. Deborah stayed the night at a small lodge, her mind looping through the sound of claws on metal and the moment when the bear's face had filled her windshield. When dawn came, she looked out over the white expanse of forest and felt a mixture of gratitude and unease. She had survived, but the memory had changed her. Weeks later, the SUV was repaired, though faint claw marks remained etched into the driver's door. Deborah never again threw food from her window. The wilderness, she realized, was not a place to take lightly. Its beauty concealed a fierce balance, one that punished carelessness swiftly. Every time she saw the faint scratches on her car, she remembered that balance, the thin line between calm and catastrophe on a frozen Yukon highway. It was March 2nd, 2025, at a large wildlife park in northern Europe, where the air was cold and a thin layer of frost covered the ground. The morning sun glowed weakly through gray clouds, casting pale light over tall enclosures that held Arctic animals from across the region. Visitors wandered between viewing areas, their breath forming clouds in the chill. Among them were Margaret and Peter, a couple in their mid-50s, who had traveled from a nearby city for a quiet weekend escape. They loved nature and had spent years visiting sanctuaries and reserves across Europe. Margaret, a schoolteacher, was known for her patience and gentle nature. Peter, who managed a small construction company, was an avid wildlife photographer. Together, they often spent weekends outdoors, capturing the beauty of places that offered peace and silence. That morning, they joined a guided tour through the park's Arctic zone. The main attraction was a massive polar bear rescued years earlier from a northern coastline. It was one of the park's most popular residents, confined within heavy steel barriers and thick glass panels. Warning signs lined the area, urging visitors to stay back, while loudspeakers occasionally repeated safety reminders. By midday, the group reached the enclosure. The polar bear paced slowly across its frosted terrain, leaving deep prints in the snow. A small crowd gathered behind the railing, phones lifted to capture the immense creature. When it stood upright, towering nearly 3 meters tall, its white coat gleamed beneath the pale sunlight. Park staff watched from nearby, ensuring no one crossed the marked line. Margaret leaned slightly forward for a better view, while Peter adjusted his camera lens. They were focused, eager for the perfect photograph. A staff member gestured for them to step back, but they were too absorbed to notice. Their movement caught the bear's attention. It stopped, its dark eyes locking onto the sound. Without warning, the polar bear lunged. The crash of its body against the barrier echoed through the enclosure, metal vibrating under the impact. One enormous paw shot through the gap, catching Margaret's sleeve and dragging her toward the rail. Her jacket tore as pain ripped through her arm. Peter lunged forward, gripping her other arm, but the force threw him sideways into the railing. A sharp crack of pain shot through his wrist as he hit the ground. Sirens erupted instantly. Park workers ran toward the enclosure with shields and sound devices. The bear struck the rail again, its claws scraping metal in a deep, grating rhythm. One ranger slammed a steel plate, creating a sharp echo that startled the animal just long enough for the others to pull Margaret free. She collapsed against Peter, her arm streaked with blood, her expression frozen in shock. For several moments, chaos filled the enclosure. Visitors screamed as staff pushed them back. Behind the fence, the bear continued to pace, agitated and restless. Medics rushed in with stretchers and supplies. They wrapped Margaret's arm in thick bandages, pressing to stop the bleeding, while Peter winced in pain beside her, his wrist bent and swelling. Around them, the Arctic zone fell eerily quiet except for alarms and the faint wind over snow. Within minutes, both were lifted onto stretchers and carried toward an ambulance waiting near the entrance. Park officials ordered the entire area closed, while rangers used deterrent sounds to calm the bear. The park's noise faded to a tense silence, broken only by the low hum of vehicles departing toward the hospital. Doctors worked through the afternoon. Margaret's wounds were deep, and she had lost considerable blood, but surgery stabilized her condition. Peter's wrist was fractured, and several ribs were bruised from the fall. Both were expected to recover. Back at the park, an internal investigation began. Footage and eyewitness statements confirmed that all barriers and signs had been intact. The park released a statement the following day, explaining that safety protocols had been ignored and emphasizing that even animals raised in captivity retained their wild instincts and immense strength. The polar bear enclosure was closed for inspection. Workers reinforced the fencing and added a wider buffer zone between visitors and the rail. New signs were installed, urging guests to respect boundaries and remember that wild creatures, no matter how accustomed to people, remain unpredictable. A week later, Margaret and Peter were released from the hospital. Both carried visible scars and heavy bandages, reminders of how a single misstep had turned fascination into fear. Their short weekend trip had become a lasting lesson neither would forget. News of the incident spread quickly, shared across local broadcasts and wildlife forums. Experts echoed the same warning. No matter how gentle or calm animals appear behind glass or steel, they are never tame. They deserve admiration, but always from a distance. When spring arrived, the park reopened. Visitors once again filled the Arctic zone, stopping to read the new warnings fixed along the railing. The frost had melted, revealing faint dents and scratches on the steel where the bear had struck. For Margaret and Peter, those marks became symbols of respect, a quiet reminder of how beauty and danger coexist, divided only by the strength of a single barrier. It was July 9th, 2024, deep in the wilderness of Kodiak Island, Alaska. The morning sky was gray and low clouds hung over the thick forest. The air smelled of wet moss and pine, and a cool wind moved through the tall spruce trees. This remote island, known for its massive brown bears, was both beautiful and unforgiving. Few people lived here, and those who came understood the rules of survival. Among a small group of hikers that day was Cynthia Reynolds, a 52-year-old travel blogger from Portland, Oregon. Her life revolved around exploring wild places, and sharing them with thousands of readers who admired her courage and curiosity. Over the years, her photographs had shown sunsets over desert cliffs, frozen lakes, and her smiling face against endless horizons. She often wrote that she wanted to see every untamed corner of the world before turning 60. This trip to Alaska was her next great story, a chance to witness the raw wilderness of Kodiak Island. The group was led by Noah Clark, an experienced backcountry guide who had spent more than 2 decades working across Alaska's remote regions. He understood the terrain, the weather, and most importantly, the bears. Before they began, Noah gathered the hikers and reviewed safety rules. Never stray from the group, stay clear of marked feeding zones, and make noise while hiking to avoid startling wildlife. It was early berry season, a time when bears often appeared near the trails to feed and prepare for winter. The hikers set out along a narrow trail winding through damp undergrowth and dense shrubs heavy with berries. The air was cool and filled with the sounds of birds calling from high branches. Each step pressed into the soft, rain-soaked earth. They carried metal pots and bear spray as precautions, their breaths visible in the misty air. After several hours, they reached a clearing near a stream bordered by low bushes. There, among the foliage, a female Kodiak bear stood with 2 cubs. Her dark fur glistened from the water, her shoulders massive and strong. She was focused on the berries, her movements slow and deliberate. Noah raised his hand, signaling everyone to stop. The hikers stood silently, watching the bear from a respectful distance. The scene was breathtaking, wildness alive and close, yet contained by quiet respect. But Cynthia's eyes were fixed on her camera. She wanted the perfect shot. As the others remained still, she took a step forward, then another. The soft click of her camera strap and the rustle of her backpack drew attention. Noah whispered sharply for her to stop, but the flags marking the safety boundary fluttered behind her as she crossed them. Her boots sank into the muddy soil as she lifted her camera toward the cubs. The bear lifted her head. A low growl rumbled through the clearing, deep and primal. The smell of granola and dried fruit from Cynthia's pack carried faintly on the wind. The animal's demeanor changed instantly, from calm to alert, from mother to defender. Cynthia froze, realizing her mistake too late. Her foot slipped on wet ground. The bear lunged forward with explosive speed, crashing through the shrubs. Cynthia fell backward as the massive animal struck her with its paw, the impact knocking the air from her lungs. Chaos erupted. The other hikers banged metal pots and shouted, the sharp noise echoing through the forest. The bear reared up, roaring, then lowered again with terrifying strength. Noah grabbed a canister of bear spray, but could not risk using it so close to Cynthia. The attack was over within moments. Brutal, instinctive, unstoppable. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the forest fell silent except for the frantic clatter of metal. The mother bear turned away, huffing and warning. Her cubs hurried behind her as she retreated into the dense brush. Branches snapped as the family vanished among the trees. Cynthia lay motionless on the damp ground. Her jacket was shredded, and the mud beneath her was streaked with red. Noah dropped beside her, pressing his scarf against the wounds. Her breathing came in shallow bursts, her eyes half open. Another hiker ran for the emergency radio pack they had left earlier on the trail. Static crackled as they tried to contact the ranger station. Minutes passed in slow agony. The cold air thickened with the smell of iron and earth. Noah spoke softly, his hands trembling as he tried to stem the bleeding, but the wounds were deep, and the color drained from her face. Before the helicopter could arrive, her breathing stopped. The forest, moments ago filled with chaos, was silent once more. When park rangers reached the scene nearly an hour later, they secured the site and guided the surviving hikers down the trail. A rescue helicopter hovered overhead before landing in a nearby clearing. Rangers marked claw prints, blood trails, and the torn ground. The bear was not pursued or harmed. The attack was deemed a defensive response. The mother had acted only to protect her young. News spread quickly across Kodiak Island and beyond. Local officials urged travelers to respect wildlife boundaries, reminding them that the island's brown bears are among the largest on Earth, capable of weighing over 1,000 pounds. Experts repeated the lesson that approaching a bear with cubs, even for a moment, was one of the gravest mistakes in the wild. Cynthia's remains were flown home to Oregon. Her family released a short message of grief and remembrance, urging others to learn from her tragedy. Friends remembered her as fearless, a woman whose passion for adventure inspired many, though her final journey had ended in heartbreak. In the weeks that followed, authorities strengthened safety measures across Kodiak Island. Trails near active berry fields were closed during feeding months. Guides received additional training, and visitors were required to attend mandatory briefings before entering remote zones. The story of Cynthia Reynolds spread across outdoor communities worldwide. It was retold in hiking forums, safety seminars, and travel blogs, not as a tale of fear, but as a warning born from respect. Her name became a quiet reminder that even the most experienced adventurers must yield to the power of nature. On Kodiak Island, the forest soon grew green again, the signs of that morning fading under moss and rain. Yet those who hike its trails still pause by the flagged boundaries where her story is now remembered, a lesson written in the silence between human ambition and the wild. It was September 8th, 2019, in the vast wilderness of western Montana, where the early evening air carried the scent of pine and distant campfire smoke. The trees stood tall and silent around a small clearing near a large mountain reserve, where Megan Thompson, a 35-year-old outdoor enthusiast, was hiking enthusiast from Oregon, had decided to spend her weekend alone in nature. Megan loved camping and hiking more than anything. She worked as a freelance travel writer, exploring remote places to find inspiration for her articles. Her friends admired her independence and determination, though many quietly worried that she sometimes underestimated the dangers of the wild. That weekend, she drove deep into the forest with a small tent, cooking gear, and a box of pastries she had picked up in town. She chose a flat patch of land beside a gentle stream, not far from a few other campers who had already set up their tents. The forest around her was calm, the air filled with the steady sound of running water and the soft calls of evening birds. Megan believed she had found the perfect spot. The area, however, was marked with clear warning signs about fire safety and increased bear activity. As the sun dipped lower, she began unpacking her gear and gathering sticks for her campfire. Nearby campers noticed that her fire pit sat too close to dry brush and tried to signal her, but Megan, confident in her experience, continued setting up. She built a small circle of stones and began arranging her firewood. Her food and snacks sat open beside the pit, the sweet scent of pastries and fruit spreading quietly through the forest air. When dusk fell, the forest cooled, and shadows deepened between the trees. Megan searched for more firewood, wandering a little farther from her tent. Behind her, something heavy moved through the undergrowth. A faint rustle became a steady crunch of branches. From the edge of the woods, a large grizzly bear emerged, drawn by the scent of food. Its thick fur rippled in the fading light, and each step left deep impressions in the soft soil. When Megan turned and saw it, her body went rigid. The massive shape loomed near her tent, its head raised as it sniffed the air. She began stepping backward, her breath shallow and quick, but her boot caught on a fallen log. She stumbled and hit the ground hard, the sound echoing across the clearing. The bear flinched, startled, then lunged forward with terrifying speed. Its paw struck her shoulder, claws tearing through her jacket and skin. Pain shot down her side as she rolled away, scrambling to crawl toward the trees. The bear swiped again, smashing her cooking gear and scattering her supplies. Pots clattered and pastries rolled into the dirt as the animal growled, lifting its head high before crashing down on the camp with immense power. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the bear paused, its dark eyes fixed on the open clearing. For a moment, it stood upright, enormous against the dim sky. Then it turned and retreated into the darkness, vanishing among the trees. The sound of its heavy breathing faded, leaving behind the wreckage of the camp and the soft hiss of wind through the pines. Megan lay trembling on the cold ground, clutching her injured side. The fire had gone out, leaving only faint red embers glowing beneath ash. The air smelled of smoke and iron. Every rustle in the forest made her flinch, terrified the bear might return. Her tent was shredded, her food scattered, her clothes soaked with dirt and blood. She pressed her arm against her ribs, trying to stop the bleeding. Pain radiated through her shoulder and chest, each breath sharp and shallow. She crawled toward her backpack, which had fallen near the stream. Inside, she found a small first aid kit and began cleaning her wounds with shaking hands. The cold stung her cuts, but she kept working, wrapping her arm in gauze and whispering to herself to stay awake. Through the trees, faint flashes of light appeared, rescuers approaching. The nearby campers, having heard her screams and the crash of the bear, had called for help using a satellite phone. Within an hour, a search and rescue team reached the site, their flashlights cutting through the dark. They found Megan near her collapsed tent, her face pale and streaked with dirt, but alive. The team worked quickly, bandaging her wounds and lifting her onto a stretcher before carrying her through the forest toward the access road. At the hospital in Kalispell, doctors treated deep claw wounds on her shoulder and arm. Several ribs were fractured, and her skin was bruised and torn, but her condition was stable. Wildlife officers later investigated the area and found clear paw prints leading north toward the ridge. The bear had not returned. Rangers confirmed that the attack had likely been triggered by the scent of exposed food, and that unsecured supplies remained one of the leading causes of bear encounters. During the following days, Megan recovered slowly. The experience left her quiet and introspective. She often replayed the moments before the attack, how calm the forest had been, how quickly it had turned violent. The other campers who had warned her visited the hospital, grateful that she had survived. Officials used her story in safety workshops, teaching that confidence in nature must always be tempered with caution. When she was finally discharged, Megan returned home to Oregon to rest. The scars on her arm and shoulder healed, though they never fully faded. Months later, she wrote about the encounter in one of her travel essays, describing not only the terror but the lesson that respect for the wild must come before all else. The forest near the mountain reserve remained as vast and untamed as ever. Rangers increased patrols and installed new signs, reminding visitors to secure food and maintain safe distances from wildlife. Megan's story became a quiet warning to those who entered the wilderness that even a small mistake, like leaving a meal unattended, could turn a peaceful night into a fight for survival.